everyone, Kareem right here. Today we have the pleasure to interview David Mirynech, who is the founder and CEO at FanClub Sports Capital. David, thank you for taking the time for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Kareem. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So can you provide an overview of your sports company, including its mission and goals?
Yeah, absolutely. So FanClub Sports Capital is a global investor community and sports syndication platform. And we give private investment managers access to out-of-the-box tools to quickly set up investment vehicles, get access to verified LPs, to make deals, in pro sports clubs in a way that's really, I think, effortless, social, and accessible. If you're thinking of comps first in the space, the way I like to describe ourselves to both partners, to investors, is we call ourselves sort of the angel list, the Yield Street, or even the iCapital of professional sports. In terms of our mission and goals, our goal here is to democratize access to investing in professional sport and really make these opportunities available to broader subsets of investor classes globally.
Yeah, that's amazing what you guys are doing. And I love that because fans are already committed. They spend time watching games on the TV, they drive to games, they buy jerseys. So the fans are already committed, and to provide them with that opportunity is amazing what you guys are doing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. And it's been an interesting journey. I think is when we initially came into this space, the goal of the platform was actually as a retail focused platform first, right? It was fan first. Quickly when we got in, we realized that there are several layers of challenges and red tape that need to be addressed. And so when we first got into market, we sort of catered more towards what I'll call the high net worth accredited investor crowd. But as we continue to build up the company, continue to add functionality, we will be in a position to start launching retail deals, hopefully towards the end of this year.
Understood. So what inspired you to start this company, and what gap in the market does it aim to address?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'll sort of, I think, maybe jump in on a bit of my background as well, because I think it's relevant to the conversation and topic. But I grew up, in Southern Ontario in Canada. I grew up a hockey player, a pretty average one, but I got swept up in the analytics movement that happened in hockey sort of in the mid-2010s. I ended up spending some time doing some sort of short analytics consulting work with some teams in the Ontario Hockey League, which is a junior hockey league located in Canada, and then also did some sort of brief stints with some clubs in the National Hockey League. Eventually stepped out, I just found a bit of a ceiling, and ultimately entered the fintech world actually as a startup employee and entrepreneur, and ended up working in that space in fintech startups of financial services for probably about 6 years after that. Spent some time, we had a bit of a merger that went on with one of our companies, and I ended up working in investment banking after that, mostly growth stage, pre-IPO private placements, and then venture capital as well, where we're mostly investing at the intersection of fintech and capital markets. And my focus always sort of throughout those years was just, how do we use technology to increase liquidity and investment access in alternative assets? So how do we open up all the awesome growth that's going on in venture capital, in private equity, in real estate, crypto, and kind of offer those opportunities to more individuals? I will say, the goal to democratize was not necessarily our incentive for getting into the marketplace, but it was more so kind of just a frank look at the state of the private capital markets, and understanding really the challenges and barriers that were present for private market companies, both in the United States, but also globally, in accessing public market financing and liquidity. So back in probably 2018 or 19, I actually got my first chance to work on a sports advisory transaction. I got to engage, I was very lucky, it was a very unique experience, got to engage in the capital restructuring of a top, let's call it 15 European football club. And it was just a really illuminating experience walking into it. I was already a sports fan, but you saw some of the trends in technology that were occurring in pro sports across media and content and technology and the fan experience. And it was really incredible to witness. But then at the same time, you saw what I would describe as probably the worst investment conditions I had seen across any vertical of the private markets present within the pro sports space. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, it's very difficult for minority owners and LPs of professional sports clubs to sell their stakes without suffering some kind of extreme, what we call an illiquid discount. The minimum buy-in for many of these opportunities was $25 million plus. And frankly, there's not a strong history of clubs entering the public markets and really achieving that exit or liquidity, that many investors in the private markets seek to get. And so for us, what really became a question of was, well, how do we reconcile all the amazing growth across technology and media? How do we reconcile the scarcity of the asset class? How do we reconcile the resiliency of the asset class with the fact that it's sort of borderline impossible for average people to deal make within the space? And so essentially our goal was to bring to bear for investors a private markets investment platform that would really give investors exposure to sports as an asset class, but then even ultimately, introduce some liquidity features down the road that would enable them to get out of their investment. Ultimately for us, I'd say sort of the inciting incident that really caused us to get into market, was the pandemic. And you notice that clubs were struggling with cash flows. Many of them are turning to debt financing and sort of loading up in unhealthy ways. And, we really saw the ability to move into market with, an equity investment platform as something that was sort of an opportune time. So launched in the fall last year, I think it's really been opportune timing, sort of given the development and maturity of the ecosystem in the space. Really our pitch is simple for our investors, which is how does sports form a piece of your alternative asset portfolio and sit next to your other alternative asset investments, your VC, your PE, your real estate, et cetera. I think in the past, if you had $25 million, you could maybe buy 0.5% of an NBA team. Now, we're working on tickets right now, working with a range of investors, frankly, but, working on investment access and opportunities all the way down to $250,000 in the major pro sports leagues and globally, which I think is quite accessible. And that also gives you the ability to not only allocate towards one asset in terms of your sports strategy, but also get diverse exposure across multiple teams, leagues, geographies, et cetera. And then I'll just say the last thing here, which I think is sort of timely, has been, probably, essentially lucky on our behalf. But I think the broader uncertainty in the public markets has actually sort of played into our hands. People are looking for uncorrelated asset classes at this point in time. They want a safe haven for their capital. And sports really has a remarkable history of being an extremely resilient asset class in all different kinds of macroeconomic conditions. Economics are driven by TV. Those are multiple years in length, those contracts, fixed cash flows. I don't think people confuse the clubs for these EBITDA cash flow juggernauts, because they're certainly not. But what they do is they post consistent valuation increase over time in extreme macroeconomic conditions. And we have amazing data on how they've held up in inflation and stagflation in the 1970s, when the tech bubble popped in 2001, the Great Recession of 2008, even the drawdown of the last year, which, in no sort of order is included, a war in Ukraine, a banking crisis, a crypto crash, sort of all rolled into one in the context of rising interest rates. And we just feel like that asymmetric return profile in a managed capacity has a role to play within people's portfolio construction.
Understood. Yeah, that there was a lot of great points that you mentioned in there. What led you down the pathway of finance and then into sports? You mentioned, venture capital, which intrigues me. I'm learning a lot about, your into private equity. So, these are very capital driven industries, and I'm always interested to learn more, and especially from you. So just share a little bit more about what led you down the path of finance and how these opportunities opened up for you down your career.
Yeah, 100%. Look, I think it was a sort of confluence of factors. Number one, I was very lucky to attend a university in Canada called the University of Western Ontario. They have a pretty renowned business school called the Ivy Business School, that if you're trying to compare it in terms of a global stage, I guess you could call it the Wharton of Canada. So getting exposure to sort of like-minded individuals and people, getting exposed to finance in that manner, had some amazing professors. I think, most kids who walk through that school are sort of geared towards management consulting or investment banking. So I think that was definitely one avenue. Not that was my, path in my early career, right? It was actually more focused on, technology within financial markets. I think, when I first sort of got involved in the startup ecosystem, my entry point was actually in cryptocurrency. And for me, it was extremely exciting. We looked at all, the way the technology was innovating around various mediums, media, et cetera. And I just thought that money was probably one of the mediums that stood the greatest chance of being disrupted and also governed daily actions on a day-to-day basis, probably more than any other medium on the planet. And so I got really involved in crypto, ended up sort of, meeting like-minded individuals and getting involved in the startup space there. Our focus in the early innings was actually in launching token sales for early stage crypto companies. And I think, what you have to remember at that point in time, it was around 2015 or 16, a lot of early stage companies in the blockchain ecosystem couldn't get access to traditional routes of financing. They couldn't get access to debt financing. They couldn't get access to equity financing. Probably only a handful of VCs that actually knew what they were doing within the space. And so, without sort of those two arrows in your quiver, we saw that Vitalik Buterin, who's the founder of Ethereum, launched his initial coin offering in 2015. That was the sale of essentially what is an economic or participatory right, to use his governance blockchain. And so that essentially became the model of financing those early stage companies. We got involved in the financing of those early stage companies using token sale structures. Eventually, and it's funny how people still think that the rules are not clear, but once the SEC sort of made the rules around token sales clear and gave their guidance on how it fit with under securities rules, and I apologize, I'm just getting a phone call quickly. Once they gave that guidance, we quickly pivoted to say, okay, well, how do we use that same technology that we think is, really underpinning and can be the future of capital markets activity and use it as actually the basis for capital raising in the private capital markets. And so that was really my entrance to it. It was sort of backdoored through the crypto sphere. I will say that, over time, I think we've sort of landed more on the finance side of this than the crypto side or even, enterprise blockchain side of this. I think it still stands to reason that technologies like that will have a large influence on the future of capital markets development. I think we do need to see probably some better tooling in things that are more accessible for investors to participate with before it becomes sort of widely spread and adopted.
Understood. You mentioned a great point back then that sports is able to handle the turbulence going on, whatever is going on in the world, like COVID-19. Sports was able to survive that. Do you have a specific sport that you tend to focus on, like soccer, for example, or basketball, or is it just very broad and all sports are surviving?
Yeah, no, look, I think what we've done here at FanClub Sports Capital is essentially bring models of private market liquidity that work extremely well in other verticals of the private markets, private equity, venture capital, and bring them to a space like sports, which I think is probably the most illiquid, but also at the same time probably has the largest potential global investor audience of any private market asset. Now, what I will say is in comparison to those other verticals, in comparison to the private equity vertical, venture capital vertical, the quantity of assets is not necessarily as high as you're going to get, in other areas. And so for us, I think taking a global approach from the beginning has always been extremely important. I'd say, de facto by virtue of where we're located as a company, which is in Toronto, but also have members of our team in other areas of North America, Philadelphia, DC, San Francisco. We are, closer to some of the capital markets activity in the sort of big five in North America and even in the minor leagues. I'll also say that, we're very much keen in learning and understanding more about the evolution of what's going on within the capital market ecosystem in European football. It's the dynamics around those investments are very much different, but I think also in terms of volume, there's a lot of people that are, potential investors, I think, in North American sports assets that kind of are priced out, of the North American markets right now. Maybe they want greater, board level governance and control. They want a greater share of the team, and you can go in and you can go over to Europe and, you don't have to buy into the top leagues, right? You can buy into leagues that are sort of in tier 2 and 3. You can get sort of outsized economic percentages. And, if you are able to actually sort of, right the ship on some of those teams, you do experience some sort of more venture capital like returns if you're able to get that club promoted up to the top league. So that's interesting. I also think that, some of those investors will say that they don't think that those European clubs are as well commercialized as North American teams. And I think they sort of see that as a low-hanging fruit that they can go into and sort of be able to implement some changes on the commercial side quickly. I will say I think that's easier said than done in a lot of cases, and I think that we're probably going to see a return profile in terms of the managers who are investing in that space maybe be similar to the venture capital ecosystem, where you're kind of hitting 2 out of 10, and it's a bit of more of a Pareto distribution. Whereas if you're buying to the North American leagues, the top 5, the economics around how the leagues are even structured themselves, and the fact that they're pretty much de facto monopolies, means that you can be a minority LP in one of those teams and kind of not have to do anything, fly to the moon for 30 years, come back, and you'll have probably made a pretty strong return, or at least consistent return on the capital you invested.
For sure. Is there a specific market that you guys are focused on, or I know you guys are based out of Toronto, but is there any specific market?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't describe the Canadian sports capital markets as sort of particularly robust. That being said, I would love to help have our platform be an engine of capitalization within Canadian sport. I think that there's a lot of growth here in men's and women's soccer. I think is super interesting here. I've been talking to some folks in the pro rugby space, in the cricket space. I think that's awesome. I think Canada is a really awesome cultural mosaic. And I think as we sort of, the demographics of the country change, I think we're going to see the development and growth of a lot sports that I wouldn't necessarily say were, initially native here or, popular here. But I think that's super exciting to be involved in a business capacity. The United States is still the mecca of sport. That's we're regulated in the United States as a registered investment advisor. There's a reason we did that. It's definitely where the bulk of assets and also the bulk of investors are located. But I'd say predominantly we're focused in North America and Europe. But we continue to look at number 1 capital partners and number 2 opportunities across the globe.
Understood. Could you share some key milestones or achievements that your company has reached since it's started?
Yeah, what I will say is, getting into this industry as an outsider and someone who is, was sort of more of a fintech guy getting into the sports industry, it's not for the faint of heart. There's sort of what I like to call 3 complex layers that kind of make up the ecosystem, right? And number 1, in that this was a sort of particular nut that we had to crack, was, well, how do we deal with, number 1, assets? Because like I said, we're very global in our scope. So how do we deal with assets on a global basis, and how do we make sure that fits within the confines of securities rules, right? So if we're dealing with a European football club, we're dealing with a North American club, maybe something, we've looked at opportunities in Liga MX in Mexico, right? How do we make sure that we're being compliant in terms of the assets that we're handling? But then on the flip side of that, how do we also make sure that we're being compliant within the context of investors that we're handling from a global basis? And that's not only as it relates to securities rules, there's all sorts of tricky tax items that need to be addressed for some of these things. And so that was frankly a lot of brain damage that had to be done towards figuring that out. I think the second component here, which is very important, is the leagues all have different rules around ownership and restrictions associated with that, right? And those might be different in European football as they relate to the NFL, as they relate to the other leagues in North America. And so really, developing a product that I think is lightweight, but also fits into commonly accepted ownership structures that are already present within those major leagues was super important for us to do. And I think I mentioned earlier, in this chat, where we sort of came to market with, not came to market, but we're, investigating how a retail platform would be effective. And we sort of pivoted more towards the high net worth investors, because it was just easier to start deal making in the major leagues and easy for us to sort of get entrenched within the ecosystem. So that sort of second component was obviously also a lot of brain damage to figure out. And then I think the third component here, which is also, important to consider, is that, for the past 25 years, the sports ownership has really been this old boys club. And, I'm was definitely coming at this as a bit of an outsider. We, sort of getting ourselves entrenched in that ecosystem was super important for us. I think for us, it was, how do we find people that are really innovative within the space, and how do we get them to see the value of what we're trying to bring to market? And so as a result, what we've done is we've tried to bring in a lot of investment bankers in the space, both on the team, on our advisory board, and into our partnership network, who have history of doing tons of transactions within the space, and then get them to really see the value of what you're trying to bring to market. And so I'd say those 3 layers took probably a lot longer than I would have expected to sort of get set up within within the market. We did launch the platform in the fall last year. We picked up our registered investment advisory license in the United States in January this year, and then we'll have some pretty cool deals to announce. We've done a couple of SPVs, mostly in the esports space, but then we're going to have some pretty cool deals to announce. I think with some reputable teams and some well-known transactions, probably over the next 30 days or so.
Awesome. A little bit back in time into the early stage of the company, can you just share how you guys started to generate lead flow and deal flow?
Yeah, look, I think the funny thing is if you know where to look for deals in this space, there's actually more deals than there are investors. And I think that sort of take of it initially was something that I didn't necessarily was able to wrap my head around for myself. Sports seemed like a very natural asset to actually prove out a private market liquidity thesis because they're so transparent. They have these global brands. It's very easy to find out financial information from valuation to debt levels to, EBITDA to how much the players make. There's news networks that report on these assets. And so there's a problem in investing in the private markets. It's called information asymmetry. And it's where, some things are hard for private market investors to get their head around in terms of information disclosure, to be able to, we don't have the same, what's the word I'm trying to look for? Establish things that have to be disclosed as in public market companies. And so sports made a natural sort of avenue for us to sort of prove out the private market liquidity thesis. What I will say is that, there's a lot of teams out there. Once you know how to find them, there's a lot. The sports industry and the private capital market ecosystem in sports is so opaque in how it works. Everything is done behind closed doors. Everything is done under the guise of an NDA. And so I think that the industry itself needs to work harder in terms of, how do we put these willing and capable investors to work? Because there's a lot of teams right now that are severely undercapitalized. You can look at the crumbling infrastructure, in stadiums, particularly across Europe and Italy, for example, that could use, a good degree of capital investment. In our view, there's a lot of investors who'd be willing to do that. It's just that the rails to be able to support that investment activity don't necessarily exist. So for us, getting access to deals, it really came from three avenues. The first was relationships with ownership that we built over time and our partners have built out. Those are directly with owners who are either majority owners or minority LPs in leagues across the globe. The second thing is relationships with deal makers. As our platform works, we are not the ones that are taking stakes in any of these teams. What we're doing is empowering larger funds or even solo GPs for that matter, current owners, multi-club ownership structures, private equity to run deals on our platform. In many cases, we're leveraging their relationships and their access to deal flow and then bringing that to bear for our investors. So that's the second way. And then the third way is, I'd say, is relationships with the investment banks. Within this space, many of these cases, they're the people who have the sell side mandate on, these either minority or majority stakes that are up for sale. I think, an interesting sort of phenomenon that's occurred within the space is that valuations continuing to grow. We're not really seeing, the likelihood of a public exit on the individual club asset level, which means that the minimum investment ticket for these clubs is also growing, by virtue and by nature of that. 1% of an NBA team can be as high as $75 million right now. It's just not that feasible for the average individual. And so I think that means that the investment banks have a harder job when syndicating some of these stakes. I'm personally aware of stakes that have been out there for 3 or 4 years and they're ice cold because there's just not one person who wants to come along and pay the $50 million for the 1%. And so I think in working with those groups, we can have some of their investors come in and actually be managers or solo GPs on the platform. We can give them access to our LP capital, which consists of family offices, private bank, private wealth, single accredited investor, and high net worth clients, and have them round out that vehicle to actually be able to take the stake in the league that they're looking for. So see that those are the three avenues: relationships with ownership, relationships with deal makers, and then relationships with the sell side mandates as well.
Understood. You guys can't do any marketing, right? Online marketing. You guys can't do any online marketing, right? Or are you guys?
No, we're allowed to market the community and the ability to invest in professional sports. What the exemptions are for marketing securities in the United States, and it depends really on the deal, and it also depends on the issuer as well who's conducting the transaction. There's frankly many different rules and exemptions underneath the Jobs Act of the United States that give you the ability to either market or not market, or the term used by the SEC is generally solicit or not generally solicit. Most of the deals we're doing right now with accredited investors fall under what's called Regulation D. There's two exemptions underneath Regulation D. One is called 506B, one's called 506C. 506B is if you're sort of shortly, sort of quietly, delivering the investment or syndicating the investment to a very close network of investment partners, not generally soliciting it. But then you also have 506C, which actually allows you to go sort of outward to the market and go to average people. The 506C is what we're seeing, occur, frankly, a lot on platforms like AngelList, where you have a solo GP. They might have been, let's say a former Andreessen Horowitz partner or something. They might have 60,000 followers on Twitter. Their kind of head gets big and they want to leave and they want to start their own. They want to start their own fund. Well, where do they go? They go to AngelList. They start their own syndicate. They do it under 506C. They're able to post the link to co-invest with them on their Twitter account. Their Twitter followers co-invest with them into deals, and they can now have, disposable capital to start being able to sort of build up their own personal investment track record. I think that's an area we would like to see the space get to. I'd say, things are probably more opaque and a little bit more siloed as it currently exists. But I think that level of social capital formation is something we're interested with the accredited investor space. I think as that continues to develop, we will hopefully, especially with the launch of our retail product, be able to offer avenues for retail investors to get involved as well, underneath other exemptions across, Regulation CF, which allows you to raise up to $5 million from unaccredited investors, Regulation A, which I think is also fairly interesting, but probably requires some conversation with the leagues, which allows you to raise up to $75 million from unaccredited investors. And then there's also Regulation S as well, which allows you to tap into foreign investors. So I think we will see, the development of the space and, the ability to tap investors across social channels and so, really sort of pursue social capital formation in the future. But, how you are allowed to market those deals really depends on the exemption which you fall under.
Understood. I know we're here up on time. Is it okay for 3 more questions, or do you have to run?
I got time, man. I got time.
Okay. I'll just crush it down to 3 more. Could you share some challenges or obstacles your company has faced and how you guys have been able to overcome them?
Yeah, no, look, I think I sort of addressed this question a little bit earlier, but it was really this sort of 3-layered obstacle that we have to go after, right? Which was, one, how do we deal within a private global securities framework? Number 2, how do we deal within league ownership rules and restrictions on a global basis? And number 3, how do we entrench ourselves with this, which is really a social layer, kind of into this old boys club of how stakes are traded hands. And I think those have been the biggest challenges. Thus far, I think, we're sort of getting to the point where we've, for the most part, in as wide of a scope as we possibly can, sought to solve all 3. But I'd say those are the ones that have definitely required a lot of brain damage to be able to overcome.
Yeah. Can you dive in a little bit more into number 2 that you mentioned in regards to following all the rules, laws, and regulations of the league?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, we've seen in North American sports, there was a history of corporate ownership within the space that existed, probably 20 years ago, right? You had Nintendo, who was an owner of the Seattle Mariners. You had Disney, who was an owner of the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim and the LA Angels as well, actually. And then, you had some cases where, let's just say, sports wasn't a core focus for these organizations. They were sort of, became forced sellers within the space. That created, precedents of transactions that I think, sold for discounts that the leagues didn't necessarily love. And I think that sort of hurt the future of corporate ownership within the space. I think, the league sort of had a policy after that, which was, if you kind of walk on 2 legs, you're a single person. That's the requirement to be able to invest in the major leagues. But then, that's also come across sort of the confluence of what's really been, an absolutely huge development in the value of media rights associated with these sports clubs. And you have to remember that sports is the last form of live content left on the planet. It's the only real form of content that can guarantee an audience to advertisers. And therefore, all the existing networks have pivoted towards sports. The new entrants, the streaming platforms have pivoted towards sports. It's made the value of those media rights extremely valuable, but it's also caused huge valuation increases across all the teams. like I said before, as those sort of valuations continue to increase, makes it harder for individuals to be able to participate because the check sizes continue to get bigger. And so back in 2019, I think was really when we started getting a lot of conviction in the space, because we started seeing the development of rule sets that were changing across the space. We saw Major League Baseball allowed private equity, the NBA open to private equity. We saw Major League Soccer and the NHL open to private equity, and we started seeing deals come into this space. Silver Lake invested in Manchester City, and it was kind of a lot of those things that I'd say gave us conviction once again. That this was a space that we wanted to be in. But to open up to private equity, the leagues had to make rules, because what you have to remember is, if you're going to be investing across multiple assets within the same league, how do you retain the competitive balance that's so integral towards the actual live and broadcast product, which is pro sports? And so I think that's going to be a moving target. I think I would describe those rules as living tree. I think as we've already seen the NBA update their private equity rules to include pension funds and sovereign wealth, and who knows where that will go ultimately in the future. But those are sort of the rules in which I'm talking about. And it's mainly the private equity rules right now and the rules around, beneficial ownership or single person ownership.
Understood. What is your long-term vision for the company, and how do you plan to achieve it?
Yeah, 100%. I think I referenced this a little bit earlier as well, but what we've really done here with FanClub Sports Capital is to take models of liquidity that work really well in other verticals of private markets and then bring them into the pro sports space. And so really the model that we took here, for FanClub was what we call the angel list model, or the yield street model, which is essentially a co-invest model with the professional investment managers with our accredited investor base that can allow them to get access to deals with smaller allocations and know that they sort of the comfort of co-investing with very sophisticated people within the space. I think what we'll continue to do, and what we really are focused on here, is just being absolutely dominant and excellent at what we're doing here. And so we want to dominate the space. We want to be excellent at it. But I think over time, we'll want to expand our services and product offerings and really have, a capital market solution that will be catered towards all different kinds of assets and all different kinds of owners. And that probably begins with a retail market at some point. So giving clubs the ability to sell direct shares to general fans and retail investors. I think that is, like I said, part of our goals, probably for Q4 or maybe Q1 next year. And then in addition to that, what we'll also do at some point in this, probably in the latter half of 2024, but is also create a secondary marketplace for investors who invested in the primary offering of these deals to actually be able to get some liquidity before there's any kind of natural organic M&A or public market exit event. And so we feel like the combination of all those three different services, the syndicate platform, the retail platform, and the secondary markets platform, create a robust end-to-end capital markets ecosystem, which services all types of stakeholders across the chain. And I think that's really what we're seeking to build out here, is not just the syndicate platform, but the robust end-to-end ecosystem.
Very exciting. Where can investors find more information?
Yeah, 100%. Feel free to check us out at fanclubsports.co is our main website. We have a pretty prominent a Substack that covers sports M&A topics. So substack.com/fanclubsports. You can find us on Twitter at FanClub Sports HQ, and then on Instagram at FanClub Sports as well. So I appreciate that.
I'll have everything put in the description, guys. And just to end off, David, I have 6 fun questions to ask, if that's cool.
100%.
Okay, so they're all favorites. What's your favorite sport?
So favorite sport growing up was undoubtedly hockey. I will say that, mixed martial arts and the UFC has also been a passion of mine for a long time. I've very much enjoyed the fights. And then I'd probably put number 3, the NFL. It's just incredible theater.
What's your favorite team in the NFL and NHL?
So my favorite team in the NHL was actually that began as the Anaheim Mighty Ducks, now called the Anaheim Ducks. I was a huge Paul Kariya fan growing up. My older brother, being sort of from the Southern Ontario area, was a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, and we're very adversarial at everything we did in life, from mini sticks to video games to road hockey. And so by nature of that, I wanted to pick a different team, and as such, Paul Kariya was my favorite player. The Ducks became a nice sort of avenue for me, and they treated me very well. as a fan. You know what I mean? I've seen 4 conference finals in my life, 2 Stanley Cup finals, 1 Stanley Cup. So that's been, a beautiful ride to be a part of. In the NFL, I did grow up in Niagara, which is about 30 minutes from Orchard Park. So the Buffalo Bills are my team, and I think that we got a pretty good squad lined up for this year.
What about your favorite player on the Buffalo team?
So my favorite players in general, say growing up, it was Paul Kariya and Teemu Selanne were my favorite Duck players. I was followed by Ryan Getzlaf and Corey Perry. I'm a fan of Trevor Zegras right now as well. But I'd say outside of hockey, Conor McGregor was really one of my favorite athletes of all time. And then obviously on the Buffalo Bills, Josh Allen's my boy.
Got it. What about favorite music?
Favorite music, I got some pretty diverse tastes, listen to a ton of alternative rock, EDM. I'd say historically the Arctic Monkeys are probably my favorite band, but, very much into Rufus Du Sol, Tame Impala. I'd say groups like that.
Favorite food?
Favorite food, if I could eat one food, I think for the rest of my life, it would probably be sushi. But I'm also a big fan of Mexican, and can't go wrong with tacos and tequila, right?
And the last one, favorite activity?
Yeah, I think what's super important is just kind of, being an entrepreneur. It obviously requires, a pretty heightened level of dedication and work. And I'd say I work some pretty crazy hours. I think what's important to remember in all that is to take care of yourself. And so just going to the gym is important kind of for a mental level set, once a day. I'm also big at just getting out for a walk. Honestly, if there's a couple phone calls I can take and go for about an hour spin, I think it's great to clear your head. I would describe myself as a little too ADHD to be able to get into meditation, but the walking is sort of my form of active meditation. So it's something I enjoy. And then I think something super important too is, just having a social life with friends and family. I think kind of being present in that and just enjoying your time kind of allows you to sort of recharge, from what is the stress of the day-to-day grind of the startup life. And, you can wake up the next morning and you're recharged and ready to bite the ass off a bear. So.
Absolutely. Well, David, it was a pleasure to have you on the One Soccer Nation podcast. I appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, thank you, man. I appreciate it. I'm ready to come back anytime.
Thank you.
Cheers.